Facebook is considered one of the most innovative companies in the world. But what if I told you that Facebook rejected the founders of WhatsApp, who sold their company to Facebook for $19 billion? Even the most innovative companies struggle with recognizing employee talent.
People are able to do more at an older age. Because of this, the workplace has gone through a series of challenges. Concepts such as recruitment, engagement, and sometimes day-to-day responsibilities have fundamentally shifted. When you have one organization, it's best to have them all on the same page. And if they're on the same page, it doesn't matter what age they are, they're working within the bandwidth and they're able to contribute to the overall mission of the organization.
Please welcome Jeff Butler.
Hi, I am Jeff Butler and I grew up in Silicon Valley in the heart of tech innovation. When I was growing up, both of my parents actually built tech companies. And by the time I was 27, I actually built my own tech company and also had a consulting company. On a day-to-day basis, I was able to be on the front lines of recruitment, engagement, and managing employees day to day.
Keep your hands raised if all three apply to you. Are you entitled, lazy, and love technology? Gallup Research recently came out with a worldwide study finding that 63% of employees in the workplace are not engaged. And that's what I want to talk to you about. How do you attract, manage,
and engage a multi-generational workforce?
Now, when we look at this framework, I call it the generational culture alignment. There's different pieces to it. The first step is alignment. Now, looking a little bit deeper at alignment, it comes down to how you relate to another person. Now, I know a lot of you probably have read things on Forbes or Newsweekly about millennials. And the funny thing is that the vast majority of people who talk about millennials are not millennials.
Problems, or one of the reasons why people even bring me in, is that they usually have a more senior crowd that's used to doing things a certain way, and they need new blood. And they hire someone younger, they come in there, and they sort of break the paradigm.
Companies all across the world, big or small, struggle with the concept of finding the right talent. Now, for me, being a small business owner of around 20 employees, I also struggle with this front. However, I was able to win over talent from places like Chase, Dell, Google to work at a small, no-name company that's only 20 people. So today I wanted to share with you that specific pattern, best practices on how do you actually not only bridge differences, but turn those differences into advantages. So service-oriented leadership. What is service-oriented leadership, and what are we going to be learning about today? Well, essentially it's like thinking about others, caring about the individual, and finding what's best for that person, right? Really understanding who you're working with on a deeper level as a leader in an organization. And a lot of the interesting things that are happening today is that there's so much changing going on with millennials, younger demographics, as you look at sort of larger tech industries like Amazon, 18-month turnover, right? And you look at Gallup Research, over 66% of employees saying that they're not engaged in the workplace. So you have all these people who are not engaged and a lot of turnover. So the question then becomes, how do you engage people effectively? And a lot of the things that I'll bring up on this talk may seem a little out there, like you're going off in a certain direction, but recognize that engagement is a huge problem across the board, and a lot of the tactics that are being used to engage people are a lot different, so they will feel a little bit awkward, uncomfortable at first. Now, here's the thing though. People, you ever heard about rapid change, right, and rapid innovation across the board, right? We've all heard that. We read the media and all of that. But how much rapid change is really taking place? Well, here's a simple quiz. Does anyone know who this individual is in the middle? Yeah, okay, we got that one. Okay, that's the easy one. Oh, what about this one? Nothing there. Okay, so no one there. All right, because this is fascinating to me, and here's why. If you look at the 2008 most viewed championships, right? We have first one, the Major League Baseball League. 19 million people watched. What about the NBA? How many do you think the NBA was? Just, you can yell out, that's fine. 30,000, okay, pretty close. 30,000, 30 million. Not 30,000. What am I? Order of magnitude off there. What about the Super Bowl? 60, 100, 50? 103 million, right? Should have had like prizes and just like threw it at people from up here. So 103 million. What about League of Legends? So one person knows what's going on here. You know where this is going. 105 million. What is that? That's what I heard. What is that? And that's sort of the paradigm that's happening right now, is that you have worlds, huge crowds of people watching sports that you've never even heard of before in events. Does anyone here know Twitch? Twitch, yeah. Online gaming platform where people can watch other people playing video games. Now more popular than NBC and CNN, and soon to take over the NFL, NBA, and Super Bowl, all of them combined. So there's all these massive changes taking place in today's industry. In addition to that, you have some companies that are catching on. Here's Bad Grandpa in the middle of a virtual reality video game. And virtual reality actually becoming a new thing today, where you have these large competitions of people playing in alternative universes in order to, I guess, win something. I don't know, maybe there's a prize at the end. I'm not really sure why they're doing it, except it looks pretty cool. If you're in it, you don't look that cool with that on that headset. So, like traditional job searches, usually where you go in the newspaper, right? You circle it, you apply, and all of that process. But now you have things like McDonald's having Snapchat ads, where basically that you can submit your application to McDonald's through just Snapchat, which is crazy to see how that's happening. So there's a lot of major shifts today that are happening. And here's a couple of the big ones. First off is the humification of companies. It's that a lot of companies are now becoming more authentic. They're sort of dropping this corporate facade and trying to appeal more to the individual. And you see this through branding, but also recruiting, that people are trying to be a lot more relatable. Then you get the gig economy. That's you guys. You're sort of leading the forefront in this, where you have these smaller jobs instead of these longer traditional employment structures. And you see this through Uber and Lyft, and it's totally disrupting the economy. And that's where the gig economy has come about. Global culture, you no longer have teams that are just here in one city, but they're all over the world. I've actually built two 100% remote teams, and it's a completely different way of managing team structures. And virtual reality, it's becoming a real thing. It's not mainstream yet, but it's just starting to crop up on the edges, on the fringes, as they like to say. So the way that this presentation works is that if you ever at a cocktail party and you want to impress people, you can use this word called the diffusion of innovation. And what that is simply this curve of when someone produces an app, it's how long it takes it to be mainstream. So in the bottom right corner, I'll step down. Sorry, camera crew. The bottom right corner is the innovators. They create the app. Then the people who stand in front of the iPhone store, well, that's the early adopters, right? And then all their friends who get it because their best friend has it, those are like the early majority, and that sort of peaks. And then over here is like my grandfather, because he doesn't even have an iPhone or anything like that. And so they're like the last ones here. So the whole point of this presentation is to take the early adopters, right? The people who are younger, who are used to all these new technologies and methods, and sync it up much closer. So we're up to date, and what we're doing actually makes sense and resonates with people who we're trying to engage. As they say, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So a lot of people are already using these techniques, but it's not common mainstream yet. So it's converging onto a single point. That's sort of my goal for this presentation. So when Dan and I were talking, the right corner is the structure that he gave me: onboarding, management, mentoring, and engagement. So I'll be covering about millennials, going over that a little bit. Engagement, because that was the biggest thing that was talked about. Everyone who I interviewed was like, engagement's our biggest issue. How do we handle it? So that's the first thing I'll be tackling. Then management, mentoring, and onboarding and recruitment I'm actually not going to be able to cover, but in the breakout sessions later, I'll be covering those in more detail along with all the other topics. So that's what we'll be going over today. Now, what a lot of people wonder though, and because there's also a short introduction so people don't have a lot of context, is that what does a 27-year-old know about, say, management, recruiting, onboarding, those things, right? Addressing the elephant in the room. So if we move forward a little bit, Who knows this place? I know one person, right? Yeah, did we talk? Who was the one? Yeah, we talked on the phone. Okay, I didn't have your face. It's not a face call, it's a phone call, so I couldn't recognize your voice. So now it's face to a name. So this is where I went to high school, right? And every day after high school, when I wasn't in a sport or in a club, I would take a 15-minute bus ride and go to this office right here on Los Gatos Boulevard. Do you recognize that? Yeah, Los Gatos Boulevard. And on the top row, there's a bunch of offices, and one of those offices, there was a startup, Silicon Valley startup that was run by my parents. Now, these are not all my parents. My dad is the one with the tie, and my mom is to his right. And so every day, I would sit in the conference room, and I would work, but I would observe what was happening. And I didn't know later on I'll be using all the management techniques that they were using. So for instance, to put this in perspective, at the time of which they had this company, they still have 2 employees that are working for them full-time, and that company was acquired and they started a new one, to give you an idea of like the loyalty and engagement that they had. On top of that, when I wasn't in the workplace doing sort of white-collar work on the weekends, I would help my dad build houses. So I started to understand blue-collar management. How is that different than white-collar? From there, I went to UC Berkeley. That's where I studied computer science, so I was actually following the talk on the application development quite closely. From there, this is Silicon Valley, and if you look, do I have a pointer with this? No, I don't have a pointer button. But those 3 little arrows, that's San Francisco. To the bottom of it, those 2 arrows right there, you have Google headquarters, and to the far right upper, that is actually around UC Berkeley. So those are all the places that I worked at in terms of companies. I worked at Nokia, Lithium, InfoScout, and a couple others, including founding my own tech company when I was 23. And that's when I managed someone. My first employee that I hired was double my age, but it was a really smooth transition, and then I didn't understand that was a huge issue. But when I started helping other companies about this, it was kind of bizarre to me because I got all this training when I was younger on how to work with people effectively. And some of those things I'll be sharing with you today in terms of what I learned during that time that I was not only running the different companies that I had, but also from my early, I guess, high school days, if that sounds interesting to you. So going forward, though, after I founded my tech company, exited, I started speaking. For some reason, I got into the TEDx circuit, spoke a couple times on there, published my first book, and I started helping companies with technology. And eventually, pointer. This is a good one, too. You can, like, shoot down a helicopter with this. I don't know why that occurred to me first. So, after I exited that company, I was giving technology talks, and then eventually someone came up to me and said, "Hey, can you talk about millennials?" And I was like, "Well, I'm a millennial. That should be pretty easy, right?" But if you look on any of the news, they say they're entitled, spoiled, unmotivated, all that stuff. And I was like, oh, how can I present on that? And I started digging deeper. And what I found is that this whole generation divide that's happening has been going on not for decades, hundreds of years, but thousands. First person to talk about that is Socrates. Socrates didn't write it down. Plato wrote it down, and he said the children have luxury, they have bad manners, contempt for authority, and they show disrespect for elders, and love place in the chatter for exercise. That sounds really close to CNN, but not quite, because a little bit. That's a pretty elegant sentence there. But it's sort of like the paradigm that happens is that the fascinating thing about the term millennial wasn't created by the Census Bureau or the government. It was created by 2 marketers who were generation experts, and they went to the media, hey, here's our book, here's our research, here's what the generations are doing. Millennials, I present to you. And all the media companies ran with it and started creating all these polarizing campaigns, and that's where you get all these weird stereotypes that don't make much sense. And if you look, the vast majority of people who talk about millennials are not millennials. That's like going to a foreign country and talking to everyone who's not been there how it's like. So my goal being a millennial sort of to give you sort of an insider perspective on some of the things that are happening on that level. So it's very difficult to talk about this subject because you have the most ethnically diverse generation there's ever been in the US. And on top of that, you're painting a decade of people all across the board. So it's extremely difficult to say they act like this or don't act like that. So I'll keep this very high level. And when I talk about millennials, I'm just mentioning people in their 20s or like 18 to sort of like 30 range. Okay, that's what I'm covering for this talk. So the first thing is the environment, how the environment's changed. As many of us have, or some of us older individuals here have been through like the 2008 crisis. A lot of younger millennials have not been through that, which actually really shapes the perspective of going out in the future and not being as sensitive to the times that we're in that are quite, I guess, respectful. It's very like, it's a lot easier in the job market. But on top of that, you start having a very interesting thing taking place where the parental structure is a little bit different too, because the parents went through it. So they become like, hey, I want to protect my children. I want to make sure they're well taken care of. And they sort of become like overburdening to the point where you get some crazy things like some mother wants to move into college with her child. And this is from the Fox News in Colorado. And it's like, hey, like, but if you see this, you'll like laugh, like, oh, that parent's so that's a helicopter and that kid can't stand up for himself. But you look deeper and you realize that she's actually trying to protect her children for something that happened in her past. And so there's just a natural human response that takes place here in terms of this parental style. Now, that's sort of the environmental aspect. The next one's technology. My first TED talk that I gave was about technology, how smartphones change the way you think. And what we start to get tuned into is, I call it the Amazon Prime effect. Like when you start expecting everything instantaneously, right? That you can buy your shoes, your pants, your blazer. In fact, the only thing that I didn't buy on Amazon Prime that I'm wearing is this blazer. And we get so expected for everything to be instantaneous, right? All the time. But then we start expecting our careers and our relationships to be instantaneous. You can't swipe left or right on a career. That takes a long time. It's a process. It's not something that is a gratification like instant, I'm done. And so what happens a lot is you have people who are not used to that adjustment when they first get to the workforce, and we'll be going over later of why that engagement is an issue. The second thing about technology is that with technology, the point is that we are able to do more at an older age. And when that takes place, people push out buying a house, getting married. So the first time in history, there's this age of 20-somethings who have no long-term obligations. And people are wondering why doesn't someone stay in my group? Why does someone always switch? Well, imagine for people who are more senior in this room, if you could not get married or buy a house till you were 33, what would you do with your life? And what you find out is that sort of behavior is very similar to what's happening with 20-year-olds today in the millennial demographic. So it's not that, it's just right now we have never seen this before, and we're trying to adapt to it. It's like first world problems on here of if someone has everything they need and they're able to do more in an older age, how do we handle it? And right now we're still adjusting to that. So those are two major things in terms of millennial behavior that I think are worth taking away. Now, two major polls that millennials have towards companies, organizations, places where they join. First one, growth. Pretty common. Harvard Business Review ranks that as #1 in their research for millennials, that they want to go somewhere that they can grow in their career. Pretty basic. Second thing, community. They want to be a part of something greater. Pretty standard. So when we go into the next portion, which would be engagement, those are the two things that we're going to be adding in this, because those are things that people said, look, I want to make sure that this is very engaging when they're in a group and make it feel like it's community. So let's break it down a little bit. Engagement. Current structure. There's a whole bunch of nannies for one particular role model manager. I was at the table in the back corner, and one person actually had 126 for one individual. So that's sort of the structure right now. It's very flat, right? There's a slight hierarchy, but the thing is it's a really good business model because it makes sense. It's like it's an Uber for babysitting, right? For being a nanny, and that's really, really on point. But as you've probably seen, there's some cracks along the way, and that's where you're getting sort of like engagement issues. So when I started thinking about this being sort of quote unquote a millennial, and I realized, okay, so you open up your app, you sign up with the platform, And eventually you start getting gigs, right? You go out, you babysit or you tutor, and you take your build, whatever, and then you go back and forth with this for a while, right? It's very removed. There's no one actually interacting with you that much, maybe the role model manager a little bit. And your friend maybe works at Starbucks. And you say, hey, this is the team that I have, this is what I'm doing. How's your job at Starbucks? Oh, and she tells you this story and that story and this story and that story and the team and blah, blah, blah. And eventually, when I started to realize this, you're really isolated a lot. It's a good thing to have, but you're very alone. And especially with the demographic that was said, hey, we're mostly like female college students, being alone is not like, just using pseudoscience here, it's not like the top priority like in their minds. So I was like, well, there's sort of a gap here. So how do we work with this, right? Because I know also margins are pretty tight. So how do you make this work effectively in an organization? It's not like you can just hire a bunch of people and say, all right, you're engaged now. So how do we make this work? So the big fallacy here is that if you give them predictable work, they will stay. And I attest this not because it's a millennial, but rather sort of the financial times that we're in. Bull versus bear market. Bull's optimistic, bear is more pessimistic. Right now, we're at a time where people can choose where they want to work. Imagine, so this will eventually happen. Maybe it's 2 years, 5 years, I don't know. I'm not one of those money guys who will tell you when the financial crisis is going to happen. When it flips, right, you have all those people in a tech company who get laid off, and they're the ones who are going to be going and working in Starbucks because they need to pay the bills a little bit. And those easy jobs that, say, the college students would be able to get, they no longer have. So now your app seems a lot more appealing, and you might not have an engagement problem anymore. You might not have a retention problem because they're like, getting a job is really hard. Right now, it's very easy comparatively to history. So that's my thing in terms of saying this whole concept of if you give them predictable work, they'll stay. Yes, because of the economic times that we're in. But once that shifts, it starts to break. So because we're in the times that we're in, how do we make this work? I always like to think about this in a little more abstract sense, is that if you cannot meet them in person, because I know that quarterly meetings is a big thing when people say engagement. Oh, we have quarterly meetings, we invite everyone, but very few people show up, right? That's sort of one of the big things for building those relationships. But how would you engage someone if you can never see them in person? Right? So it's a more difficult challenge. So I've built 2 100% remote companies where I probably met 1 or 2 of them in my life. My number 1 employee right now, she lives in Canada. I met her one time. She saw me at a conference, and I said, hey, you want to work for me? Oh, sure. It's pretty cool. And so now she handles like a lot of my calls, but she represents me, like the whole brand. So it's super important position. But she's like one of 10 different employees that I have all over the world. And engagement was a huge issue early on. So I started to figure out what to do effectively in an organization when you have just no face-to-face contact. So looking at case studies here, does anyone here? No, probably no one here knows Envision because it's a tech company. Well, Envision's a tech company in Silicon Valley, has over 1 million customers, 16 different time zones, 100% remote. 2017, Glassdoor rated it one of the best companies to work for. 100% remote. How do they do this? CEO, Clark Velberg, says increasing the communication bandwidth, video conference calls, having that continuous feedback. From hearing this, I started adding bi-monthly calls with the entire team. Second week of doing that, we had a huge breakthrough in revenue. Why? Because they started cross-collaborating and talking about problems that were happening. Bingo.